What does it mean for a harvest to be the last one? Is it the end of a season, the end of a family's legacy, or the end of a person's hope? For 19-year-old Ilara, standing in the suffocating heat of the Oakhaven Town Hall, it felt like all three. This was a place built on the bones of tradition, a small isolated village where a person's value was not measured by the kindness in their heart or the thoughts in their head, but by the strength in their back and the calluses on their hands. Here the earth was a stubborn god, and only the strong were worthy of its blessings. The air in the hall was thick with the smell of dry timber, sweat, and the unspoken judgments that had been passed down through generations like worn-out tools. It was the annual pre-harvest meeting, a ritual as old as the village itself, where futures were decided and failures were laid bare for all to see. Ilara stood beside her father, Thomas. She was a whisper of a girl in a room full of shouts, slender and pale, with eyes the color of a gentle sky after a storm, her mother's eyes. They were the only part of her that seemed to hold any light. She wore a simple, faded dress, her hands clasped in front of her, knuckles white. She did not belong here, and every soul in that room knew it. Her father, once a man as solid as the ancient oaks that gave the village its name, was now stooped, bent not just by age, but by a grief so profound it had hollowed him out from the inside. He was a silhouette of his former self, a living monument to loss, and Ilara, standing beside him, felt like the final crumbling stone of that monument. The hum of conversation died down as Thomas shuffled forward. His voice, when it came, was a dry rustle of leaves, cracking with a fragility that made everyone shift uncomfortably in their seats. He spoke of the northern field, that stubborn patch of land that had lain fallow since his wife's passing, a wound in the earth that mirrored the wound in his heart. He asked for help, just a few hands, a few days of labor to turn the soil, to give it one last chance before the season turned for good. It wasn't a plea for charity. It was the last prayer of a broken man, offered up to a congregation of his peers, people he had known his entire life. A silence descended upon the hall, but it was not a silence of respect. It was a cold, hard silence, heavy and suffocating. Then, from the back of the room, a sound cut through the tension, a laugh. It was a cruel, booming sound, full of arrogance and contempt. It belonged to Silas, the heir to the largest farm in the valley, a young man built like a bull, with a mind just as narrow. He stepped forward, his shadow falling long and dark over the dusty floorboards. "Help?" he scoffed, and the word echoed with derision. He looked directly at Thomas, but his eyes flickered to Ilara, stripping her bare with their disdain. "Why are you asking for help, old man, when you have a strong daughter right there?" He paused, letting the poison of his words seep into the air. "Oh, that's right, I forgot." He smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. "She's only good for pressing flowers and staring at the clouds." A wave of snickers rippled through the crowd. It wasn't a roar of laughter, but something far worse, a quiet, knowing agreement. Men nudged each other. Women covered their mouths with their hands, but their eyes were sharp with judgment. In that single, brutal moment, Ilara's deepest fear was realized and held up for public display. She was useless, a decoration, a pretty fragile thing in a world that demanded iron. She felt the blood drain from her face, her body turning to ice as hundreds of eyes bore down on her. But the deepest cut was not her own shame. It was seeing what it did to her father. She watched him visibly shrink, his broad shoulders caving in as if under a physical blow. The last flicker of pride in his eyes was extinguished, leaving only the dull ash of humiliation. He had come, here to ask for help, and had left with only shame, a shame she felt she had placed upon him. And have you ever felt that? That moment when the world's judgment feels like a physical weight, pressing down on your chest, stealing the air from your lungs. A moment where you are seen not for who you are, but for who everyone has decided you are. A moment where you look at the people you love and see your own perceived failure reflected in their eyes. If you have ever felt that crushing weight, that profound and lonely sting of being utterly misunderstood, then you know the silence that filled Ilara's world as she and her father walked home. The walk from the village was a journey through a landscape of their own defeat. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, mournful shadows across the fields. The air, which usually smelled of rich soil and growing things, now seemed to carry only the bitter taste of dust and failure. They didn't speak. What was there to say? The verdict had been delivered. Thomas walked with his eyes fixed on the dirt path, each step heavy, as if he were dragging the weight of the entire northern field behind him. Ilara walked beside him, her gaze lost in the distance, seeing not the beauty of the golden hour, but the stark reality of their situation. Their path took them along the edge of the property, right past the field in question, the northern field. It was more than just unplowed land. It was a scar on their farm, a constant nagging reminder of everything they had lost. The earth was dry and cracked, a web of fissures that looked like a parched and desperate mouth. Weeds, tough and thorny, had claimed it as their own, their defiant green a mockery of the life that was supposed to be there. A few skeletal remains of last year's forgotten crop stood like tiny, brittle grave markers. This field was the physical embodiment of the village's whispers. It was a symbol of Thomas's grief, of his failing strength, and in their eyes, of Ilara's worthlessness. It was the place where hope had gone to die. As she stared at that barren expanse, Silas's words echoed in her mind, no longer coming from his voice, but from her own. Useless, only good for pressing flowers. The snickers of the crowd became a chorus inside her head. For years she had tried to ignore the whispers, the sideways glances, the way the other farmers would speak to her father, as if she weren't even there. She had tried to hold on to the memory of her mother, a woman who had taught her that strength wasn't just in muscle, but in understanding, in listening to the land instead of just commanding it. But now, that quiet confidence was gone, eroded by years of doubt and shattered by one afternoon of public ridicule. The villagers saw a girl who was too soft, too quiet, too much like her mother in all the ways that didn't matter to them. They didn't see the keen mind that could identify every plant in the valley, that understood the subtle shifts in the soils, chemistry, that knew the secret language of the seasons. They saw only what she wasn't, a son. They saw a liability, a drain on a farm that was already sinking. And as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the hills, plunging the northern field into a deep, purple shadow, Ilara began to see the same thing. She began to believe their verdict. Her isolation was no longer just a feeling. It was becoming a physical reality, a prison built of shame and scorn. The fences of their farm, meant to keep livestock in, now felt like they were meant to keep her trapped, a spectacle of failure for all to see. The world she had known, the only world she had ever known, had turned its back on her, and in its place was a vast, echoing emptiness. She felt a profound and terrifying loneliness, the kind that makes you wonder if you exist at all when no one truly sees you. She stood there long after her father had gone inside, the cool night air raising goosebumps on her arms. The field before her was a dark, empty canvas. It represented everything she was supposed to be but wasn't. It was her family's past, a testament to her mother's sudden absence and her father's slow decline, and it felt, with a dreadful certainty, like her future. A barren, unproductive and worthless stretch of earth, forgotten by the sun and left to be reclaimed by the thorns. What happens when a person is told they are worthless so many times that they start to believe it? What can possibly grow from soil so poisoned by doubt? As the first stars began to prick the blackness of the sky, Ilara felt a cold despair settle deep in her bones. She believed nothing could. She believed this was the end. She didn't know that sometimes the most resilient seeds are the ones that must lie dormant in the coldest, darkest ground before they can finally, against all odds, begin to grow. The silence inside their small farmhouse was a different kind of silence than the one in the town hall. It wasn't cold and sharp, with judgment. It was a thick, heavy blanket of shared sorrow, woven from years of unspoken words and unresolved grief. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. Dust motes danced in the fading light, illuminating a world frozen in time. On the mantelpiece, a single framed photograph of a smiling woman with Ilara's eyes seemed to watch over the room, a cheerful ghost in a home that had forgotten how to smile. This was the world Ilara's mother had built, a place once filled with the scent of baking bread and drying herbs, with the sound of laughter and the quiet hum of a life lived in harmony with the land. Now it was just a museum of what they had lost, and Ilara and her father were its lonely, silent curators. To understand the wound that Silas had so cruelly ripped open, you have to understand the world that existed before the silence, before the accident, before the northern field became a scar. Ilara's childhood was not one of grueling labor, but of wondrous discovery. Her mother Annalise was a woman who did not command the earth but listened to it. She saw the farm not as a battlefield, where one fought for every stalk of wheat, but as a complex and beautiful symphony of life, where every creature, every plant, had its part to play. Their farm had been different from the others in Oakhaven. It was smaller, yes, but it was more alive. Clover grew between the rows of corn, enriching the soil. Hives of bees buzzed in the apple orchard, their pollination a quiet act of magic. Annalise taught Ilara the alchemy of the soil, the secret conversations between roots and fungi, the way a certain flower could protect a vegetable from pests. She taught her that true strength wasn't about the force you could exert on the land, but the wisdom you could learn from it. Ilara was her mother's shadow, her eager apprentice. While other children were learning to drive a plow, Ilara was learning to identify the subtle signs of a mineral deficiency in a leaf, or the precise moment to harvest herbs for maximum potency. Her hands were always stained with soil, but her mind was filled with names, patterns, and connections. Her dream, a secret she whispered only to her mother under the vast canopy of stars, was to one day leave Oakhaven and study botany at a university far away. It was a fantasy, a foolish, impossible dream for a farmer's daughter, but Annalise never treated it as such. She encouraged it, nurturing Ilara's curiosity as carefully as she nurtured her most delicate seedlings. In those moments, lying in the cool grass, her mother's arm around her, Ilara felt like the world was a book of endless wonders, and she was just beginning to learn how to read it. Then, one autumn afternoon, the book slammed shut. The accident was a brutal mechanical thing, a story of worn metal and a moment of tragic carelessness involving a piece of old, unreliable harvesting equipment. It was a senseless, ugly end to a life of grace and beauty. Ilara remembered the sudden, terrible silence that fell after the shouting, a silence that seemed to swallow all the sound in the world. She remembered the way the vibrant colors of the farm seemed to instantly fade to gray, but most of all, she remembered the look on her father's face. Thomas, a man as strong and steady as the oaks that gave the village its name, simply broke. It wasn't a loud shattering, but a quiet, internal collapse, leaving behind a hollow shell that looked like her father, but was someone else. Entirely. The light in his eyes went out that day, and it had never truly returned. In the seasons that followed, grief became the new master of their farm. Thomas still worked, but it was the work of a machine, devoid of the passion and pride he once had. He moved through the motions, his body remembering the tasks his heart had forgotten. The farm began to reflect his inner state. Fences sagged, tools rusted. The intricate systems Annalise had created, the delicate balance of companion plants and crop rotation, began to fail without her intuitive touch, and the northern field, the place where she had been planning her next great experiment, became a memorial. He couldn't bring himself to touch it. To plow under the last soil his wife's hands had touched felt like a final, unbearable betrayal, so he let it go. The land, left untended, became a mirror of his own heart, fallow, choked with weeds, and haunted by what it used to be. For Ilara, the loss was twofold. She lost her mother, her mentor, her confidant, but she also lost her father. He was there physically, but the man who had once tossed her in the air and called her his little sprout was gone. In his place was a quiet, grieving man who looked at her and saw a ghost. He saw his wife's eyes, his wife's smile, his wife's slender frame. He loved her. She knew that in some distant, buried part of him, but her very existence was a constant, agonizing reminder of his loss. She was the living embodiment of everything he could no longer have, and so an invisible wall grew between them, built of shared pain and the things they could never bring themselves to say. She became a quiet presence in a silent house, trying to make herself smaller, less conspicuous, as if by fading into the background she could lessen his pain. This quiet, internal world of grief was amplified by the loud, judgmental world outside. Oakhaven was a place built on a simple, brutal equation. Hard work equals survival. For generations, they had fought the rocky soil, the unpredictable frosts and the summer droughts. Their values were forged in that struggle. Strength was measured in bushels per acre. Worth was measured by the calluses on your hands. There was no room for nuance, no appreciation for a different kind of knowledge. A man who could lift a hay bale was a man of substance. A woman who could birth strong sons to work the land was a woman of value. In this rigid, unyielding worldview, Ilara was an anomaly, a problem, without a solution. She was not a son. She was quiet, observant, and thoughtful in a place that mistook contemplation for laziness. The whispers followed her like a shadow. At the general store, she would hear the women talking in hushed tones as she passed. "A shame about Thomas," they'd say, their voices dripping with a pity that felt more like condemnation. "That farm is going to ruin. A daughter is no help when the fields need ploughing." The men at the tavern were more blunt. They saw Thomas's grief not as a wound to be healed, but as a weakness to be scorned, and they saw Ilara as the living symbol of that weakness. They remembered Annalise as a bit strange, with her odd planting methods and her talk of the soil's spirit. Now they saw that strangeness magnified in her daughter, twisted into something they perceived as useless and indolent. The public shaming at the town hall was not the beginning of her trial, it was merely the sentencing. This social exile had practical, devastating consequences. Their credit at the seed merchants, once ironclad, was now tenuous. The blacksmith seemed to always be too busy to repair their aging plough. Neighbors who once would have offered a helping hand during a difficult season now just offered a tight-lipped nod as they passed by. The farm was an island, and the sea of the community was slowly but surely receding, leaving them stranded. They were failing, and in Oakhaven, failure was a contagious disease that no one wanted to catch. The weight of this quiet ostracism was immense, a constant grinding pressure that wore away at Ilara's spirit day by day. And always, there was the northern field. Every morning, she saw it from her bedroom window. Every evening, she passed it on her way back from the well. It was a constant physical reminder of everything that was wrong. The thorny weeds that grew there felt like the villagers' sharp words. The cracked, dry earth felt like her father's broken heart. The skeletal remains of the previous year's forgotten crop looked like the bones of her own dead dreams. It was the place where her mother's life had ended, and where, it seemed, her own future was destined to die as well. The field was a symbol, not just for her, but for the entire village. It was proof of the narrative they had all agreed upon. The farm was dying, Thomas was a broken man, and Ilara was the useless daughter who was letting it all happen. Have you ever felt that? The suffocating weight of a story that other people have written for you? A story where you are the villain or the fool or the failure, and no matter what you do, you can't seem to change the ending they've already decided upon. It's a unique kind of prison, where the bars are made of whispers, and the locks are forged from low expectations. You begin to doubt your own voice, your own memories, your own worth, because the chorus of disapproval from the outside world is so deafeningly loud. You start to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they are right. This was the poison that had been seeping into Ilara's soul for years. The humiliation in the town hall was simply the moment the poison finally reached her heart. Silas's words were not just an insult, they were a confirmation of her deepest, most terrifying fear. The fear that her mother's teachings were useless fantasies, the fear that her quiet nature was a fatal flaw, the fear that she was a burden on the father she loved, a constant source of his pain and his shame. She looked at her hands, hands that knew how to test the pH of soil and coax life from the most stubborn seeds, and for the first time, she saw them as the villagers did, soft, pale, and utterly worthless. The sun set on another day of her quiet existence, the sky bleeding into shades of orange and purple over the skeletal silhouette of the northern field. The world was beautiful, but she could no longer see it. She was trapped inside the story they had written for her, a story of failure and decay. She felt the last embers of her own hope begin to cool, turning to ash in the pit of her stomach. She believed, with a certainty that felt as solid and unchangeable as the rocky soil of Oakhaven, that this was her reality now. This was all she would ever be. But what happens when a person is pushed to the absolute edge of their own despair? What grows in a heart that has been ploughed under and left to go fallow? She believed her story was over, that the final chapter had been written. In a dusty town hall filled with scornful laughter, she could not have known that the deepest roots often grow in the darkest soil, and that a legacy, buried and forgotten, was waiting for the right hands to bring it back into the light. The days that followed the town meeting were not merely a continuation of Ilara's quiet suffering, they were the beginning of a deliberate and systematic siege. The village's passive scorn, once a cold current she could navigate, had frozen into a solid wall of ice. The whispers were gone, replaced by something far more chilling, a silence that was loud and pointed. When she walked the path to the village, neighbors who would have once offered a curt nod now found something intensely interesting about the horizon. their faces turning away as if she were a carrier of some terrible plague. The world had not just judged her, it had excommunicated her. Every closed door, every averted gaze, was a fresh nail in the coffin of her belonging. The farm, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its fences marking the boundary of her exile. The weight of this shunning was a physical thing, a pressure in her chest that made each breath a conscious effort. Her first real taste of this new, hostile reality came at the general store, a place that smelled of burlap, dried beans, and the sweet dust of milled flour. She went for seeds, a simple act of hope, a small rebellion against the verdict that had been passed on her family. She approached the counter, her list clutched in her hand, a fragile prayer on a scrap of paper. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, a man whose children she had played with as a child, didn't meet her eyes. He polished an already gleaming countertop with a greasy rag, his movements slow and deliberate. When she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper, he stopped. He looked not at her, but at a point just over her shoulder. His response was low, meant only for her, but somehow seeming to echo through the silent store. "Credit's been suspended, Ilara," he mumbled, his jowls tight with discomfort. It's bad business. Investing in a failing farm." The words were not shouted, but they struck her with the force of a physical blow. Bad business. Failing farm. He was not just denying her seeds, he was validating every cruel word Silas had spoken. She felt the hot blush of shame creep up her neck as she backed away, the eyes of the other patrons on her, their faces a mixture of pity and grim satisfaction. She had become a cautionary tale. Walking home, the empty seed sack felt heavier than a full one ever could. The merchant's words became a relentless chorus in her mind, joining the echoes of Silas's laughter and the villagers' snickers. And a new, more insidious voice began to join them, her own. Maybe they were right. What had her mother's knowledge ever truly accomplished here? It hadn't saved her from a brutal death. It hadn't saved her father from his grief, and it certainly wasn't saving Ilara now. Her understanding of the soil felt like a child's fantasy in a world of harsh adult realities. She looked at her hands, the hands that could coax life from the most delicate seedlings, and saw only weakness. They were not her father's hands, broad and calloused from a lifetime of hard labor. They were her mother's hands, and in this world, that was a liability. She felt a profound and aching guilt, a sense that she was not just failing her father, but actively dragging him down, her. Her very presence a constant reminder of the strong son he never had. The cruelty, however, was not content to remain in the realm of commerce and whispers. It needed a more personal, more vicious outlet. Behind their small house, nestled against the stone wall of the old spring house, was Ilara's last sanctuary. It was a small, meticulously tended garden, no bigger than a dining table. Here, she grew the plants from her mother's memory, rare herbs, oddly colored vegetables, and companion flowers, whose purposes were a secret language only she understood. It was the one place where her mother's legacy felt alive, a vibrant, thriving testament to a different kind of wisdom. It was her only connection to the girl she used to be, the one who dreamed of books and universities. One afternoon, drawn by the sound of coarse laughter, she rounded the corner of the house to find a scene of utter desecration. Silas and two of his friends were there. They were systematically destroying her garden, their heavy farm boots stomping and kicking, grinding the delicate plants into a muddy, fragrant pulp. Silas met her gaze, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face. "Just helping with the weeding," he sneered, before deliberately crushing a stalk of blooming lavender under his heel. The scent that rose from the broken plant was a sweet, agonizing perfume of her loss. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. A cold, hollow numbness spread through her, so profound it felt like a part of her had died with the garden. She simply stood there as they laughed and walked away, leaving behind a scene of casual, thoughtless brutality. When they were gone, she knelt in the mud, the ruins of her small world clinging to her dress. She touched a bruised leaf, a snapped stem. Each broken plant was a fresh wound in her own heart. This was not just an attack on a garden, it was an attack on her mother's memory, a final, definitive statement that everything she held sacred was worthless and deserving of contempt. When her father found her there, sitting silently amidst the wreckage as dusk fell, he said nothing. He simply placed a heavy hand on her shoulder for a moment, then turned and walked away. But in that brief touch, she felt not comfort, but a shared, bottomless despair. He saw it too. There was no place for them here. There was no hope left to cultivate. In a final desperate act, she sought out the one person she thought might listen, the one person whose authority was meant to temper the cruelty of the crowd, the village elder. She went to his home, a stern, imposing house on a small rise overlooking the town, a place of supposed justice and wisdom. Elder Hemlock listened to her plea for a small loan, for some form of intervention, his fingers steepled under his chin, his eyes cold and distant. He let her finish, his silence an unnerving void. When he finally spoke, his voice was as dry and brittle as autumn leaves. "Child," he said, the word dripping with condescension, "the natural order has been upended on your farm. A man leads, a woman supports. Your father grieves, and you attempt to fill shoes that are not yours to wear." He leaned forward, his gaze hardening. "You are bringing shame upon his name, Ilara. Go home. Learn your place. That is the only way you will find peace." It was the final door slamming shut, locked not with scorn, but with the cold, unyielding iron of tradition. She was not just useless, she was unnatural. She was a source of shame. Have you ever been told that your very nature is a mistake? That your ambitions, your strengths, your very way of being in the world is wrong? It is a wound that cuts deeper than any insult, for it attacks the very core of who you are. Elder Hemlock's words poisoned the last wellspring of her spirit. She walked away from his house, not just defeated, but fundamentally broken. The villager's judgment was one thing. The elder's pronouncement felt like a divine decree. She was a blight on her family's name. Every problem, the fallow field, her father's grief, their poverty, she now saw as a direct result of her own flawed existence. The world was not just happening to her, she was the cause of its decay. Her guilt was no longer a quiet whisper, but a roaring torrent threatening to pull her under for good. The days that followed blurred into a grey haze of hopelessness. The farm itself seemed to be dying with her spirit. A leak in the barn roof went unfixed, the slow drip a funereal rhythm counting down their final days. The chickens laid fewer eggs. The old milk cow seemed to grieve with them, its eyes dull and listless. Thomas barely spoke at all now. He moved like a ghost through the rooms of the house, his presence a heavy, silent accusation. Ilara would watch him from the window as he stood at the edge of the northern field, just staring, sometimes for hours, lost in a past she could not reach, and a future that seemed to have been cancelled. The sight of his stooped shoulders and hollowed-out face was an agony she could no longer bear. Every glance he sent her way, no matter how benign, felt laced with disappointment. She was the living, breathing proof of his failure to carry on the family line, the weak link that was causing the entire chain to break. The pressure mounted until it became a physical pain, a constant tightness in her throat. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. The faces of the villagers haunted her waking hours. Silas's sneer, Henderson's averted eyes, Hemlock's cold disapproval. Their voices echoed in her dreams. Useless. Failure. Shame. The northern field, visible from her bedroom window, became a terrifying spectre. Its cracked earth and thorny weeds were a perfect reflection of her own inner landscape, barren, broken, and choked with pain. It was her past, her present, and with a terrifying certainty, her future. There was no escaping it. As long as she stayed here, she would be this girl, the girl from the northern field, the girl who was only good for pressing flowers. One night, as a cold rain began to fall, tapping like skeletal fingers against the window pane, a decision crystallized in her mind. It was a thought that had been a whisper, then a murmur, and was now a clear, cold command. She had to leave. She could not stay here and watch her father wither away under the weight of her failure. She could not endure one more day of being invisible, of being a ghost in her own life. To leave would be its own kind. Of death, a severing from the only world she had ever known. But to stay felt like a slower, more agonizing demise. The rain outside was washing the world clean, and she felt a desperate need to be washed clean too, to escape the mud and the shame of Oakhaven and disappear somewhere no one knew her name. Quietly, so as not to wake her father, she moved through the darkened house. She packed a small, threadbare bag with the few things that mattered, a change of clothes, the last of their bread, and a small pressed wildflower, a gift from her mother from a lifetime ago. Her hands trembled as she worked, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a cannon shot in the oppressive silence. She was a thief in the night, stealing herself away from her own life. Her final stop was the barn. She didn't know why she went there, perhaps to feel the familiar presence of the animals one last time, or perhaps to stand in the place where her mother's. Laughter still seemed to echo faintly in the rafters if you listened hard enough. It was a place of work, of life, but tonight it felt like a tomb. She stood in the center of the dusty, hay-scented space, the rain drumming a mournful tattoo on the tin roof. This was it, the absolute end, the final surrender. She had tried in her own quiet way to hold on, to honor her mother's memory, to help her father, but she had failed. The village was right. The elder was right. Silas was right. She was useless. A profound, bone-deep weariness settled over her, a despair so complete it felt like peace. There were no more tears to cry, no more hope to be extinguished. There was only the cold, hard certainty of her own worthlessness. She sank to the floor, her back against a rough-hewn wooden beam, the small bag falling from her grasp. She closed her eyes, letting the darkness inside and outside merge into one. This was the bottom. This was the place where a person either breaks completely or finds something in the wreckage to begin again. But as the cold from the earthen floor seeped into her bones, Ilara felt nothing left to find. She was ready for the breaking. The rain on the barn roof was a sound of finality, a cold, indifferent drumming that seemed to be counting down the last moments of her life in Oakhaven. Each drop that struck the tin was another voice whispering the words she now believed: useless, worthless, shame. Ilara sat on the hard-packed earth, the chill seeping through her thin dress and into her bones, a cold that felt like it was coming from the inside out. This was the end. The small bag beside her, holding the meager artifacts of her existence, was a testament to her surrender. She was a ghost leaving a haunted house, a house haunted not by spirits, but by the crushing weight of memory and failure. In the darkness, the familiar shapes of the barn, the stalls, the hayloft, the neat rows of hanging tools, were blurred into monstrous silhouettes. This place, once a sanctuary of life and work, now felt like a mausoleum for her family's hopes. Her mother's laughter was a faint echo she could no longer hear, drowned out by the relentless drumming of the rain and the roaring of her own despair. She had come here for a final goodbye, but there was nothing left to say farewell to. As she prepared to stand, to take that first step into the anonymous darkness of the world outside Oakhaven, a thought, small and fragile, surfaced through the fog of her. Grief, a keepsake, one last thing, something of her mother's, something to hold on to in the lonely nights to come. Her eyes scanned the shadows, landing on the corner where her mother had kept her own special tools, small, delicate trowels, strange-looking hoes and wooden markers with their names written in a graceful flowing script. They were coated in a thick layer of dust, untouched since the day of the accident, a silent, rusting memorial. Ilara ran her fingers over the smooth, worn handle of a hand fork, the wood still holding the faint imprint of her mother's grip. It was here, in this corner, that her mother had been most herself, a quiet alchemist, turning soil and seed into life. As her hand moved along the wall, her knuckles brushed against the edge of a floorboard near the foundation. It shifted, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but it was enough. Curiosity, a feeling she thought had died in her, stirred faintly. She pushed at the board with her fingertips. It gave way, with a low groan, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a nervous flutter against her ribs. She reached into the cold, musty space, her fingers closing around something solid, wrapped in thick, oiled canvas. It was heavy, substantial. With trembling hands, she pulled it out and into the faint moonlight filtering through a grimy window. She unwrapped the canvas, her breath catching in her throat as she revealed what lay within. It was a book, a thick, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with use, and on the first page, in that same elegant script from the garden markers, was her mother's name, Annalise. This was no simple diary of daily thoughts. As Ilara turned the pages, her eyes wide with a dawning, incredulous awe, she realized what she was holding. It was a meticulous, scientific record. Page after page was filled with detailed drawings of root systems, charts tracking rainfall and soil pH, and complex notes on plant genetics. It was the secret work of her mother's life, a testament to a mind so brilliant and a passion so deep that the rest of Oakhaven had been utterly blind to it. Here, in elegant, precise language, her mother had documented her greatest project, the one she had been planning for the northern field. For years, Annalise had been secretly crossbreeding their farm's hardy but low-yield wheat with a forgotten native grain, a wild grass that the other farmers considered a weed. She had been developing a new strain, a unique crop that her journal entries described with a scientist's precision and a poet's love. It was a plant designed for Oakhaven's harsh realities, engineered to be incredibly resilient to the valley's sudden frosts and summer droughts. The drawings showed a plant with a deep, complex root system capable of finding water where other crops would wither. The notes described a grain with a nutritional profile far richer than anything the other farms produced. It was not a crop born of brute force and ploughing, but of intelligence, patience, and a profound understanding of the land's secret language. It was a legacy of wisdom, not of sweat. It was everything Ilara had been taught, not as a fairy tale, but as a science. As she read, the rain outside seemed to soften its rhythm, the drumming turning into a gentle patter. A single beam of moonlight broke through the clouds, piercing the gloom of the barn and illuminating the open page in her lap. It felt like a sign, a message, sent across the years. The voices of the villagers, Silas's cruel laughter, the elders' cold pronouncement, they all began to fade, their power diminishing with every word she read. They had called her mother strange. They had called Ilara useless. They were wrong. They were blind. They saw only the surface of things, the strength of a back, the breadth of a shoulder. They had never seen the real power that lay dormant in their own soil, the power her mother had unlocked. A new feeling began to displace the cold despair in Ilara's chest. It was a slow-burning ember at first, a tiny spark in the vast darkness of her grief. But as she turned page after page, the spark grew, fanned by her mother's words, until it ignited into a fierce, defiant flame. This journal was not just a book. It was a key. It was a weapon. It was a map leading out of the prison they had built for her. The thought that had been forming in her mind was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. She would not run. She would not surrender her home, her father, her mother's memory to the ignorance of these people. She would fight, and her weapon would be the very knowledge they had scorned. Her battlefield would be the northern field, that barren, cursed patch of earth, the symbol of all her family's pain and shame. She would take that field, that monument to their defeat, and she would make it live. She would use her mother's secret, her own quiet understanding, and she would show them all what true strength looked like. It was a plan so audacious, so impossible, that a part of her trembled with fear. The entire village would be watching, waiting, wishing for her to fail. And what about you? If it were you sitting in that dusty barn, holding the one thing that could save you, but also make you the target of an entire community's scorn, what would you do? Would you take the safe path and disappear into the night, leaving the judgment and the pain behind? Or would you find the courage to stand up, to turn, and face the very people who broke you, and fight for your truth on their terms, on the very ground they thought you were unworthy to walk on? It's a choice between survival and honor, between disappearing and becoming. For Ilara, in that moment, there was no choice. The girl who had collapsed on the barn floor hours earlier was gone. In her place was someone new, someone forged in the crucible of public shame and resurrected by a legacy of hidden wisdom. She closed the journal, holding it to her chest like a shield. The rain had stopped. The silence that followed was not the heavy, suffocating silence of grief, but the clean, quiet stillness of a world washed new. A profound sense of purpose settled over her, as calm and as solid as the ancient stone foundation of the barn. She knew the path ahead would be harder than anything she had ever endured. It would be a lonely, back-breaking war waged against the soil, the weather, and the relentless, hateful gaze of her neighbors. She would be an army of one. She stood up, her movements no longer hesitant or broken, but filled with a newfound resolve. She tucked the journal safely back into its wrapping and hid it again, not out of fear, but out of strategy. This was her secret, her power, and she would wield it on her own terms. She walked out of the barn and into the pre-dawn air, the sky to the east just beginning to bleed with the pale grey light of a new day. The world smelled of wet earth and clean air, the scent of new beginnings. She looked across the farm to the northern field. It was still a dark, ugly scar on the landscape, a place of thorns and ghosts, but she no longer saw it as a symbol of her failure. She saw it as a promise. It was an empty canvas, waiting for her to paint a masterpiece of defiance. Her father found her there as the sun finally broke over the horizon, standing at the edge of the field, her hands on her hips, her gaze fixed and intense. He saw the change in her instantly. The hollow, haunted look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a fire he hadn't seen since Annalise was alive. He didn't understand it. He didn't know about the journal, about the impossible plan taking root in his daughter's mind. He only saw that the fragile girl who had been withering before his eyes had been replaced by a woman made of iron and will. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He could only watch as she turned, gave him a single, determined nod, and walked toward the tool shed. He watched as she picked up not a delicate trowel, but a heavy, rust-pitted scythe, its long blade hungry for the weeds that had choked their land for so long. She was not just going to work, she was going to war. And as she took her first steps onto that fallow ground, a solitary figure against the rising sun, she knew that what was about to unfold would not just be the last harvest. It would be the first day of a new world, or the last day of hers. The battle for the northern field had begun. The news did not arrive as a formal announcement, but as a poison carried on the wind. It started with a lone rider, a trapper from the high ridges, his face pale with a fear that had nothing to do with wolves or bears. He spoke of a change in the air, a deep and unnatural cold settling in the peaks, a stillness that preceded a great and terrible frost. He called it a killing frost, a freak weather event that descended once a generation to scour the valleys clean, a white phantom of death for any crop left unprotected. The word spread from the blacksmith shop to the general store, from the tavern to the church steps, a contagion of panic that gripped Oakhaven in a cold fist. The sky, which had been a clear, hopeful blue, seemed to take on a metallic, ominous sheen. The air grew thin and sharp, carrying a scent not of earth and harvest, but of ice and endings. For the farmers of Oakhaven, this was not just a threat. It was a death sentence. The valley descended into a quiet, desperate chaos. Men who had spent their lives commanding the earth with plough and sinew now stood helpless before the sky. They looked at their fields, the wheat just beginning to turn to gold, the corn heavy on the stalk, and saw not the culmination of a year's hard work, but a vast and beautiful graveyard waiting for its shroud. This was a force they could not fight with muscle, a challenge they could not overcome with stubbornness. Their entire world, the legacy of their fathers and their fathers' fathers, was balanced on the razor's edge of a few degrees of temperature. You could see the fear in the way they walked, their shoulders slumped, their eyes scanning the horizon for a sign that wasn't there. The arrogance that had filled the town hall just weeks before had evaporated, replaced by the raw, primal terror of men about to lose everything. Their strength, the only currency they had ever valued, was suddenly, utterly worthless. It was in the late afternoon of the first day, with the sun casting long, sickly yellow shadows, that Ilara saw him coming, Silas. He walked not with his usual arrogant swagger, but with the hesitant, broken gait of a man on his way to his own execution. He did not approach the house. He stopped at the fence line of the northern field, a place he had once associated with mockery and ruin. He stood there for a long time, just staring. He was not looking at Ilara. He was looking at the impossible sight before him. Her crop, the strange, unfamiliar grain from her mother's journal, was a sea of the deepest, most vibrant green he had ever seen. It seemed to hum with a life force that defied the coming cold, its leaves thick and waxy, its stalks robust and confident. It was a picture of life in a valley that was preparing for death. He looked from her field to his own, visible in the distance, a sprawling empire of conventional wheat that now looked fragile and doomed. When he finally raised his eyes to meet hers, the man who had publicly humiliated her was gone. In his place was a boy, his face stripped bare of its pride, his eyes wide with a terror that was deeper than just the fear of financial ruin. It was the existential terror of a man whose entire worldview had just been shattered. He, the heir to the valley's greatest farm, the embodiment of Oakhaven's ideals of strength and power, was about to be destroyed. And she, the useless girl, the one good for pressing flowers, was standing on the precipice of a miracle. He gripped the top rail of the fence, his knuckles white, the wood groaning under the pressure. His mouth opened, but for a moment no sound came out. The words, when they finally emerged, were a ragged, choked whisper that the wind almost stole away. "Help me," he said. It was not a demand. It was not a negotiation. It was the last prayer of a drowning man. Ilara said nothing. She simply stood on her side of the fence, her hands loose at her sides, and watched him, the silence that stretched. Between them was more profound than any sound. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of every snicker, every scornful glance, every whispered insult she had endured. In that moment, she held all the power. The world had presented her with a perfect poetic justice, a revenge so complete it was almost divine. She could turn her back. She could walk away and leave him to his fate, leave them all to the ruin they had so eagerly wished upon her. She could watch from the warmth of her home as the frost consumed his fields, his pride, his future. She could become the richest landowner in the valley, buying up their failed farms for pennies on the dollar. She could prove, once and for all, that she was not just their equal, but their superior. The temptation was a dark, sweet poison in her veins, a voice that whispered of triumph and retribution. It was everything she had secretly craved, to see their judgment turned back on them, to watch their world of brute force crumble before her. World of quiet wisdom. And isn't that the ultimate test? When you are finally given the power to crush those who have crushed you, what do? Do you become the monster they were, proving that the only lesson you learned from your pain was how to inflict it on others? Or do you find in the deepest part of your wounded heart a different kind of strength, a strength they could never understand? For a long moment, Ilara let the silence hold him, let him stand in the full, agonizing weight of his desperation. She saw in his face not just the fear of a lost harvest, but the dawning horror of his own irrelevance. He was a king whose castle was made of sand, and the tide was coming in. She looked past him to the smoke rising from the chimneys of the other farms, and saw not the faces of her tormentors, but the faces of their children, of families who had done nothing more than follow the lead of the loudest voices. She thought of her mother, a woman who coaxed life from the earth, not to dominate it, but to nurture it. A victory built on the starvation of her neighbors would not be a victory. It would be a desecration of her mother's memory. Slowly, deliberately, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. She looked past Silas, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the still, cold air to the other farmers who had begun to gather at a distance, drawn by the spectacle of their champion's defeat. "Gather your families," she said, her voice devoid of triumph, filled only with a calm, unshakable authority. "Bring every blanket, every scrap of canvas you own, and bring firewood. Meet me back here at sundown." She did not wait for a reply. She turned and walked toward the house, leaving Silas standing at the fence, his head bowed, a silent, broken statue in the fading light. Her father met her at the door, his face a mask of confusion and awe. He had witnessed the entire exchange. He placed a hand on her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Ilara," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "What are you doing?" She looked into his eyes, and for the first time he saw not the ghost of his wife, but the fierce, unyielding spirit of his daughter. "I'm saving us," she said simply. "All of us." As twilight bled across the sky, they began to arrive. They came not as a mob, but as a humbled congregation. They came in ones and twos, then in family groups, their faces etched with a mixture of shame, desperation, and a fragile, flickering hope. They carried lanterns that cast dancing, uncertain shadows across the ground. They piled their blankets and their wood in a silent offering at the edge of the northern field. They avoided her eyes, shuffling their feet in the dirt, the silence of their shame as loud as their previous laughter had been. Silas was there, his father beside him, the older man's face a grim portrait of a lifetime of pride reduced to dust. The village elder, Hemlock, stood at the back, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but his presence a clear admission of his own failed wisdom. They were an army without a general, waiting for orders from the one person they had tried to drum out of their ranks. Ilara emerged from the barn, her mother's journal tucked under her arm. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. In the absolute stillness of the pre-frost evening, her words carried with perfect clarity. She opened the journal and began to explain. She spoke of her mother's work, of the science behind the crop's resilience, and then she laid out the plan, a strategy born from her mother's meticulous notes on surviving sudden temperature drops. They would create a protective blanket of smoke, a technique the journal called smudging. Small, controlled fires built at the edges of the fields would create a layer of warm air and particulate matter that would act as an insulator, preventing the ice crystals of the frost from forming directly on the plants. At the same time, they would use a special mulching technique, covering the base of the most vulnerable crops with a thick layer of straw and dried leaves to protect the root systems from the penetrating cold. It was a race against time, a desperate, audacious battle against the coming night. For a moment they just stared at her, their faces illuminated by the flickering lantern light. The idea was so foreign, so contrary to every farming tradition they knew, that they couldn't process it. Then Silas, without a word, turned and walked to the woodpile. He picked up an armful of firewood and a shovel and headed toward his own field. That single action broke the spell. One by one, the other men followed his lead, their movements clumsy at first, then gaining a frantic, purposeful rhythm. A strange and powerful energy filled the valley. It was the energy of a community not just fighting for its survival, but being reborn. Ilara moved among them, no longer an outcast, but a teacher, a leader. She showed them how to build the smudge pots, how to space them for maximum effect. She demonstrated the mulching technique, her hands moving with a practiced, gentle efficiency. The women, who had stood back uncertainly, soon joined in, tearing strips of canvas and organizing the distribution of materials. The work was brutal. The cold was a living thing, a predator that gnawed at their fingers and stole the breath from their lungs. The air grew thick with smoke, stinging their eyes and choking their throats. They worked under the cold, indifferent light of 1,000 stars, their world reduced to the small circle of their lantern light, the rasp of their own breathing, and the frantic scrape of shovels against the earth. Ilara worked alongside them, her slender frame belying a stamina that seemed almost supernatural. She moved from field to field, checking their work, offering quiet words of encouragement, her presence a steady, calming anchor in the storm of their panic. She saw her father, Thomas, working with a strength and purpose she hadn't seen in years. He was not the stooped, broken man from the town hall. He was a farmer again, fighting for his land, but more than that, fighting beside his daughter. There was a pride in his movements that had been absent for a decade, a light back in his eyes that was brighter than any lantern. As the night wore on, the social order of Oakhaven dissolved in the smoke and the cold. Silas worked shoulder to shoulder with Thomas, the two men communicating not with words, but with shared, desperate labor. The village elder was on his knees, his fine clothes stained with mud, spreading mulch around the base of a young cornstalk. The barriers of wealth, age, and status had crumbled. They were no longer neighbors or rivals. They were simply people, fighting together against a common enemy, led by the girl they had cast out. The night became a long, grueling vigil. Once the preparations were complete, all they could do was tend the fires and wait. A small band of humans huddled against the vast, cold indifference of nature. Ilara stood on a small rise, overlooking the valley floor, a patchwork of glowing embers and swirling smoke under a star-dusted sky. The temperature was dropping. You could feel it in your teeth, a deep, penetrating cold that promised death. She clutched her mother's journal to her chest. She had risked everything, her own miraculous harvest, her one chance at victory, on a theory written in a book, and the hope that people could change. Now all she could do was wait for the dawn. The deepest cold came just before sunrise, in that black, breathless hour when the world seems to hold its breath. A profound silence fell over the valley, the only sound the crackle of the dying fires. Then it began. A fine, glittering dust seemed to materialize in the air, catching the faint starlight. The frost. It descended not as a storm, but as a quiet, insidious blanket, coating every surface with a layer of delicate, deadly ice. The leaves on the trees at the edge of the valley turned brittle and white. The grass crunched underfoot. It was a beautiful and terrifying sight, a world transformed into a crystal palace of death. Ilara watched, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. Had it been enough? Had her mother's knowledge, her own desperate gamble, been enough to hold back the inevitable? The faces of the villagers, illuminated by the last of the fires, were pale and drawn, their eyes fixed on the fields, waiting for the verdict. The sun rose, not with a triumphant burst of warmth, but with a slow, reluctant light, as if it were afraid of what it would reveal. The first rays touched the highest peaks, then spilled down into the valley, setting the frosted world ablaze with 1 billion points of light. The sight was breathtaking. The entire valley floor was white. From a distance it looked as if a gentle snow had fallen, but the farmers knew what that white blanket meant. They knew the cellular structure of a frozen plant, the way the ice crystals would pierce the cell walls, turning a living thing into a limp, blackened ruin by midday. A collective groan of despair rose from the gathered villagers. It had been for nothing. They were ruined. But Ilara kept her eyes fixed on her own field, the northern field. As the sun climbed higher, melting the thinnest layers of frost, she saw it. A hint of green, a dark, defiant color, pushing through the white. She started to walk, then run, toward the field. Her boots crunching on the frosted ground. The villagers followed, a slow, funereal procession. She reached the edge of the field and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. It had worked. The plants were coated in a light layer of frost, but they were not brittle, they were still supple, still alive. The smoke had created a microclimate, keeping the temperature just above the critical point. The mulch had protected the roots. Her mother's crop, her impossible crop, had survived. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, and then they looked at their own fields. The wheat was damaged, the outer leaves scorched by the cold, but the stalks were standing. The corn was battered, but the ears were protected. They were not unscathed, but they were not destroyed. She had not just saved her own farm, she had saved them all. The harvest that followed was the stuff of legends. Ilara's northern field yielded a crop so abundant, so rich, that it was more than enough to feed her and her father for a decade. The grain itself was unlike anything they had ever tasted, with a nutty, wholesome flavor that seemed to carry the very strength of the earth within it. The rest of the valley's harvest was diminished, yes, but it was a harvest nonetheless. There would be no starvation, no ruin. There would be hardship, but there would be survival. And in that survival, there was a profound and humbling lesson. The seeds from Ilara's harvest became the most valuable commodity in Oakhaven, not just for their resilience, but for the story they carried. They were a symbol of a new kind of wealth, a new kind of strength. A month later, another town meeting was held in the same dusty, timber-framed hall, but the atmosphere was not one of judgment and scorn. It was one of reverence and humility. The room was packed. Every soul in Oakhaven was there. This time, when Thomas and Ilara entered, a respectful silence fell. People parted to let them pass, their eyes filled not with pity, but with a deep and profound respect. Thomas walked with his back straight, his head held high, a man resurrected. He did not need to speak. His pride was a palpable force in the room. He stood beside his daughter, placing a hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. It was a declaration of love, of pride, and of the passing of a torch. Then Silas stepped forward. He stood in the center of the room, in the very spot where he had delivered his cruelest insults. He was not the arrogant bully from before. He was a changed man, humbled and quieted by the events of the past weeks. He looked directly at Ilara, and his voice, when he spoke, was clear and steady, and it reached every corner of the hall. "I was wrong," he said. I measured a person's worth by the strength of their back. I believed that power came from the force you could exert on the land, on other people." He took a deep breath. "Ilara has shown us that true strength is not in the muscles. It is in the mind. It is in the heart. It is in the courage to nurture life when everyone else is focused on conquering it. She saved my farm. She saved all of our farms. She saved this village. And for my part in her suffering, I am truly and deeply sorry." He then turned to Thomas. "You have a daughter stronger than any 10 sons, Thomas. You are the richest man in this valley." A new chapter began for Oakhaven. The northern field became a living laboratory, a place where Ilara taught the other farmers her mother's methods. The village began to thrive, their crops becoming more resilient, their yields more abundant. They learned to work with the land instead of against it. They learned to value wisdom as much as they valued work. Ilara never did leave to study at a university. She realized she had already found her life's work. She was not just a farmer. She was a teacher, a scientist, a leader. She had not just saved a harvest. She had cultivated a new future for her entire community. Her mother's journal, once a hidden secret, became the founding text of a new way of life in Oakhaven. How many times in our own lives are we put into a box defined by the narrow judgments of others? How often are we told that our unique strengths are weaknesses, that our quiet passions are useless? We are told we are too soft, too loud, too different, too much. We are made to feel that we do not belong, that our contributions have no value. But Ilara's story is a powerful reminder that the world's judgment is not a final verdict. It is merely a challenge. True strength is not about conforming to the expectations of others. It is about having the courage to cultivate the unique and powerful seeds that lie dormant within you, even when the world around you is a cold and barren field. It is about understanding that the most profound transformations in the soil and in the soul happen when we have the courage to believe in a different kind of harvest. The final image is of Ilara, years later, standing on the same rise overlooking the valley. The northern field is no longer a solitary patch of green, but part of a vibrant, thriving tapestry that covers the entire valley floor. She is not alone. Her father stands beside her, his face weathered but peaceful, and beside them are the children of the village, listening intently as she points to the fields, her mother's journal open in her hands, passing on the legacy of wisdom to a new generation. She has not just found her place in the world, she has reshaped the world to make a place for her. If this story of turning shame into strength, of finding power in the very things you were taught to hide, resonated with you, let us know in the comments. There is a turning point in every life, a moment where we choose to accept the world's verdict or to write our own. If you have ever lived through such a moment, write, "I have also experienced a turning point."